Many teachers have asked us for some advice on how best to plan as an English department for Junior Cycle English. Here's some of the advice that we can offer. Step 1. Look at your year planner. We're going to plan for second and third year at the same time, so we drew up a grid showing how long each term or half term would be in these years. We all know that term lengths can vary considerably from year to year, so it's helpful to know in advance whether a particular half term might be too short to fit the unit that you might design for it. Step 2. Look at the guidelines and hang some anchor texts. Well, here are the guidelines for second and third year. 2 novels from the prescribed list, 2 drama texts. Remember, one of these dramas can be an extract from a drama that doesn't appear on the prescribed list of dramas. The guidelines also state that students intending to take the exam at higher level should have studied a Shakespearean drama from the prescribed list. Next, the guidelines state that students must study either a film from the prescribed list or a biography or travel text or documentary. At least 16 poems over the 2 years. Some of these poems will be studied in depth and some will be used as stimulus or support material for other texts. The choice of which poems to study is completely up to you as the teacher or your English department. Students should also study a number of non-literary texts as well as a number of short stories over the course of each year. When we look at these guidelines, it's clear that some of these texts will take longer than others to explore with a class. Common sense suggests that we will need to allow a significant block of time to focus on a novel or a drama. That's why I suggested that, having looked at the guidelines, you might like to hang some of the anchor texts into a time slot where there's room for them. The choice of when to do your prescribed text is entirely up to your English department. You need to think about what will suit your students and your school. In this case, we decided to hang our anchor text like this: Drama 1 in the first term of second year, Drama 2 in January of third year, then our first novel and our second novel, and we look at film in January of second year. As you can see, we put our second drama, which will be our Shakespearean text, into the January term in third year. In 2017, that will only be a 5-week term, so we decided to plan that as a 12-week unit from January until Easter. Step 3. Choose themes for your units. All our plans will be based around the 39 learning outcomes, but we found that it was much easier to plan when we had a theme in mind. You might begin with your theme and pick text to suit, or, as we did here, you could begin by choosing a text from the prescribed list which will suit the needs and interests of your class. We picked Lovers by Brian Friel, and then choose a theme suggested by the text. We went for relationships. Of course, I should point out that we could have simply written Drama 1 theme relationships into our department plan and allowed each teacher in the department the freedom to choose a drama. We did the same here. We thought our students would enjoy The Weight of Water by Sarah Crossan. It's a very short but beautifully crafted novel, and it sat well with the theme of growing up. From January until midterm, we would approach a film. We thought that Life is Beautiful would appeal to the hearts and minds of our students, and we decided to build a unit around the theme of war. From February until Easter, our theme would be Being Unique. One of the teachers had an idea involving the 1980s Apple ad called Here's to the Crazy Ones. And from Easter to summer, we decided on Challenging Times, Events that Rock the World as a theme. It made sense to draw up a broad outline of what would be covered in third year at the same time as we were drawing up our second year plan. After all, the guidelines are drawn up for second and third year combined. So we slotted in Of Mice and Men as our second novel, and Great Writers as a theme for November to Christmas. In January, we would tackle our Shakespearean drama. We decided on Romeo and Juliet in a unit called Conflict. Remember, we left ourselves plenty of time for this meaty text. And that brings us up to our last term, a very short one in 2017. We went for an uplifting theme, inspiration, for the weeks running up to the exams. So we have looked at the guidelines and hung some of the anchor texts into time slots where we felt they'd have room to breathe. But it may seem a bit uneven at this point. Like, what text will be used from February until summer? Well, you might slot 2 poems in here, and here, and maybe 2 non-literary texts. The old apple ad I mentioned earlier would be an ideal non-literary text here, or maybe a clip from the film Temple Grandin. And you could easily find non-literary text for the Challenging Times unit too, and perhaps a couple of short stories. Remember, the guidelines state that students should study a minimum of 16 poems over these 2 years. So at this stage of the planning process, we could commit to building poetry into most of our units. 2 here about relationships, maybe 4 war poems here, a friendship poem down here in 3rd year, and so on throughout the year. Short stories would find an obvious home here in a unit on great writers. A story like My Polish Teacher's Tie would be a great addition to the relationships unit. You could continue to add short stories and non-literary text to many of these units, and we can continue the planning process then as a department, confident that we will all meet the guidelines for 2nd and 3rd year, which are laid out on page 10 of the English specification. Step 4. Plan which learning outcomes to address in each term or unit. Remember, there are 39 learning outcomes in total. You will have addressed a subset of 22 learning outcomes with your class in 1st year. You're not finished with those 22. You'll meet them repeatedly right up until the end of 3rd year. But now, in 2nd and 3rd year, you need to include all 39 learning outcomes into your planning. With your department, you could decide which learning outcomes to focus on in each unit of work. We found it helpful to separate them into main learning outcomes and supplementary learning outcomes. The main ones will be the focus of your lessons and your assessment, but the supplementary ones will also be addressed through your teaching. For example, we might have a series of lessons which focus heavily on addressing Reading 7, which asks students to select key moments from their texts and give value judgments on main characters or key scenes or favourite images. So that would be our main outcome. But to achieve that, we ask students to express their feelings and ideas in groups. So while Oral 2 isn't our main focus, it is being addressed through our group activity. So we put it down as a supplementary outcome for this particular unit. You might also ask how we chose which learning outcomes to address in each unit. Well, here, for example, we decided to study a novel. And if you read through the learning outcomes, you'll see that certain oral reading and writing ones are particularly suited to a novel, such as Reading 4 and Reading 6 and Writing 7. So we made sure to include these as some of our main outcomes right from the outset. In the same way, the decision to study a film in this unit meant that we scoured the English specification for learning outcomes that lend themselves to film studies, like Reading 6, 7, 8 and 9 and Writing 7. Writing 7 asks students to respond imaginatively in writing to their texts. So it seemed that any writing activity would be enhanced by drafting and redrafting, so we included Writing 1 as a supplementary learning outcome. It may not be our main focus in that series of lessons, but it can certainly be a guiding presence. As the oral communication task happens in May, it would make sense to increase our focus on oral language skills during this term. But as the strands should be integrated, writing could also be a main focus. Perhaps Writing 5 could be our cue. Perhaps students could listen to a famous speech to learn lessons in structure and tone or narration, which they could then use to enrich a blog post to add to the school website. Remember, a written piece such as this blog could be a strong addition to the collection of student texts, or could perhaps be an assessment task to go towards their summer report. Oral strengths were still at the forefront of our mind as we reached the last term of 2nd year. So we were careful to include all the main learning outcomes to be assessed through the oral communication task here. You could continue in this way with the learning outcomes for the 3rd year plan, or you could leave that planning to a later date. Step 5. Make sure that the learning outcomes are spread across each year plan. At this stage of your planning, you'll have a list of learning outcomes which seem to be particularly suited to each unit. You need to do a quick audit at this stage to see if there are any that have been neglected. Step 6. Populate each unit with texts and activities which will help your students to achieve the learning outcomes. At this stage of your department planning, you have decided which main texts are to be covered in each unit of work, and you've chosen where each of the learning outcomes are most sensibly placed throughout the plan. If you have a large department, you could perhaps take a unit each at this stage and develop it further, putting some thought into supporting texts and working out how to assess the learning outcomes you've chosen. In this case, one teacher in the department took the theme and the learning outcomes which her department had decided upon, and she came up with a unit plan. She'll use Lovers by Brian Friel as the first drama text, and having looked at the complicated teenage relationship depicted in Lovers, she'll watch a story of unrequited love in the short film The Wonderful Story of Calvin Kind. She's even included an alternative text there for her colleagues to choose from. Perhaps they could read the touching short story My Polish Teacher's Tie instead. She also included a love poem. In this case, she's gone for Shakespeare's Sonnet 18. Step 7 is a vital step. Make sure to align assessment with the learning outcomes. This plan would include several modes of assessment. Teacher observation of class and group discussions would be an acceptable way to assess Oral 2. Oral 5 might involve students peer assessing each other's oral presentations using success criteria which they've co-created with their teacher. A written project could assess Writing 3, and this project could earn them marks for their Christmas report. The possibilities are endless. The important thing to remember is that all assessment must be tied to at least one learning outcome. This department decided to assess Writing 8, write about the effectiveness of key moments from their text, commenting on characters, key scenes, favourite images from a film, a poem, a chapter, a media or web-based event. Here's one of the assessment tasks that this teacher devised to assess that outcome. You are directing a scene from Brian Friel's Lovers. Select an actor to play one of the parts and explain why that actor would be the perfect casting choice for this scene. And so, to summarise, each unit should have a carefully selected set of learning outcomes and a selection of text to support the learning. And when it comes to assessment, there are a wide range of ways to assess whether students have achieved the learning outcomes which you set out to teach them. What is important is that you show a clear alignment between the assessment and the learning outcomes.